Hello, and welcome to FBL Have a Beer, where I invite you to. I've got to be honest with you guys, I'm not going to be able to do that this time. I would usually invite you to have a beer and talk FPL with me, but it's only 1 o'clock in the afternoon, so I'm actually drinking. Don't think you can see that. A Pepsi Max. So welcome to this video. Please like and subscribe if you enjoy the video. Over the last few days, I've been making the video that I kind of really wanted to make on this channel, which is to discuss my research along with, which I did with FPL Raptor and a couple of other colleagues on FPL and mental health. But while I was making that video, I sort of wanted to discuss the experiences or how the media had covered that research. So the newspapers, and also I went on BBC Radio and discussed it, what I'm going to talk about today. I think it even got picked up by Sky News, and they talked about it a bit. But I kind of realised when writing the script for that video that it was going to make the video very long, and the media coverage is perhaps not that relevant to actual FPL and mental health. So what I decided was I'll make a shorter, separate video about it, which is what I'm going to discuss here today. So the other thing I wanted to say before I continue is thank you everyone in the FPL community who's been so welcoming in the last week. I literally only made my first YouTube video less than a week ago. It was a week ago tonight. And I've had a fabulous response to one of the videos. Thank you for everyone that's watched that. And also just the fabulous welcoming experience in the FPL community more generally. So I got a shout out from Steve-O, one of my content creator heroes on Elite FPL last night. FPL Juice who invited me on. They're showing a couple of months. So yeah, just thank you. It seems like a wonderful community. So briefly let's talk about what the research showed. I mean, I'm going to cover that in more detail in the next video. But what we basically did is we took about we asked about 2,000 FPL players to take part. And we asked them we asked them things about their FPL experience, how many seasons they've been playing, how many mini leagues they were involved in, how many leagues they were involved in that involved like a cash prize, and then things like about how much time they spend thinking about their team, how much time they spend talking to people on social media about their team, how much time they spend watching podcasts, etc. And then we also asked them, how does fantasy football affect various aspects of their mental health, such as how often does fantasy football make you feel anxious, how often does fantasy football make you feel depressed. And what the research generally showed, again I'll get into this more in the next video, is if you're someone who's heavily invested in fantasy football in terms of the amount of time you spend researching, the amount of time you spend on social media or thinking about your team, fantasy football is more likely to have a negative effect on your mental health, like make you feel more stressed or anxious, but it's also more likely to have a positive effect on your mental health, so make you feel good if your fantasy football team does well, I guess, compared to players who are less involved, players who just spend 10 minutes deciding what transfer they're going to make each week. And that kind of makes sense, doesn't it? If you're heavily involved, heavily invested in something, when your team does badly, you're going to feel more crap than if someone who feels less invested, you can, be that stress or anxiety or whatever. And if your team does well, you're more likely to feel positive and elated about your team doing well, again, compared to someone who isn't really involved that much in the game. So that kind of, again, I'll go into more detail in the next video, but that kind of summarises what the research showed. And for anyone who's interested, I've left the link to the actual published paper in the description below. So there is a relationship between fantasy football and mental health that should not be understated, but it's kind of the link we would assume that's there. If the more involved you are, particularly if you're financially involved, you're going to get more pissed off, stressed if your team does badly. You're more likely to feel good if your team does well, compared to people who are less involved or don't have any involvement in money. So just before we look at the BBC interview, So when the research was published, which was in June this year, it was picked up by several newspapers, including, if I can find it, one of the most official, non-biased, trustworthy newspapers out there, the Daily Star. If you can't tell that I'm being ironic there. And let's see how they reported the research that I just told you about. Playing fantasy football hurts your mental health, and websites should have a warning, we're told. A new study has suggested that playing too much fantasy football could destroy your mental health, and websites should come with a warning about side effects. Now, that is obviously a gross over-exaggeration of what I just summarised to you, the research. I did suggest in my press release about the paper that perhaps FPL and certainly websites, fantasy football websites that involve gambling, a form of gambling because money's involved, should have some sort of warning, on the website in the same way as a gambling website would, just saying, if you get overly invested with this, it may affect your mental health. But we certainly didn't say it would destroy your mental health. FPL hopefully is not going to make you jump out of a window or end up in a psychiatric unit anytime soon. But as I said, I don't want to downplay it. It does have a negative effect if your team does badly and you're a really invested player. And obviously other papers did pick this up, but this is probably like the worst headline. This is from the Daily Mail. Okay, so I'm going to move on to talking about the interview on BBC Radio. So I'm just going to go tell you what happened. So it was the first day of the Premier League season. I was working at home, so I woke up at about 9 a.m. I was going through my emails, and I had an email from a research person at the BBC asking me if I'd go in to do an interview at 6 o'clock that evening. So this was the first day of the season, so the FPL deadline was at 6:30. So I think they basically wanted me to talk through for the first half an hour before the deadline. This is BBC Radio 4 PM, by the way, if anyone's interested in this specific programme. You can't actually get it it's not actually available online anymore. So I was a bit like, is this real? But I did a bit of research and it was real. So I replied and said, I was going to reply and say, yes, I can definitely do that. But this maybe will be the most revealing thing about the video in terms of does FPL affect your life or mental health. There was no way I was going to go and do an interview at 6 o'clock when it was the first day of the season and I could be watching Andy's deadline stream or whatever to get any last minute team news. I know I've made a video saying that I don't really like deadline streams, but I do watch them on the first day of the season and when I'm on Wildcard. So there was no way I was going to be at BBC Radio to do that. So basically I was almost going to turn down a fantastic opportunity for my career and, just something really fun because I wanted to make sure I knew if Gabriel or Saliba were going to get dropped or whatever, like they did a couple of seasons ago. So that possibly shows, the extent to which FPL maybe doesn't control that's not really related to mental health, but, affects what we're going to do. If you're not doing something important because of an FPL deadline, that's probably not good. Anyway, to continue. So basically they agreed, instead of doing that, I would go in the afternoon, I think it was about 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and do a 30-minute video interview, with the presenter there. I can't remember her name. And then they would air it at 6 o'clock. So really, I'm not really going to complain about the BBC here. They were lovely. The interviewer was lovely. The researcher was lovely. And we got into a lot in the interview. So we talked about what fantasy football is in quite a bit of depth. Then we talked about specifics of the research in a lot more detail than I just briefly summarised there in this video. We talked a bit about my FPL playing experience, why I got into the research, lots of different stuff. So I went in, got home, I was watching the programme. It got to 6 o'clock, whatever time the deadline was. It was half an hour before the deadline, and I'm waiting for my interview to be aired, and it doesn't air, and then it gets to 5 minutes past 6, 10 minutes past 6, 15 minutes past. Basically, they've condensed the interview down to 5 minutes, which did, I have to say, piss me off a bit. Although it's probably my own fault because I've had actually gone in and done the live interview. Obviously, they couldn't have edited it down. So I've not actually listened to this interview. I did listen to it, for a couple of days after, but for 2 months. So I thought I would basically just listen back to the interview with you and sort of react live as it goes on. So here is a recording of the interview. As I said, it's not actually available online anymore.
Well, TikTok, we're just over 2 hours away from the first Premier League game of the season, and that means, you know what, we're 35 minutes away from the closing of the fantasy football transfer window. If you have no idea what that is, PM's very own Harvey Stevens is here to explain.
Okay, right, this really pissed me off. I spent 5 minutes giving a really, really detailed, good explanation of what FPL was, and then they completely cut that out and had this guy, I was about to say moron, I don't know him, this guy explain it instead, which did piss me off quite a bit.
Fantasy football is a game where football fans pick a team of 11 real-life footballers who score points based on their performances. For example, if I pick Manchester United's Marcus Rashford and he scores a goal tonight, he'll get me 5 points. If he gets sent off, I'll be docked 3. There are various points for different on-field situations.
And that's wrong, isn't it? He didn't even explain it right. The sending off's -2, isn't it? I'm fairly sure. So not only did they cut me out, the guy who's explaining it didn't bloody explain it right.
Like these. You then join mini-leagues with your friends where your total points are tallied up, and I will no doubt come out victorious in this year's PM mini-league.
Oh, well, thanks, Harv. Let's see. Turns out we have an entire league going on the PM floor, and I had not noticed that one bit. It all seems like good fun, but is it? Turns out fantasy football can be good, it can be bad, and it can be downright ugly for your mental health. Dr. Gary Britton is a lecturer.
That's me, by the way.
In psychology at Queen Mary University in London. He's been looking at fantasy football leagues for some time and how they can affect emotions and well-being. He told me what he'd found.
So tell me in the comments, can you tell how heavily edited this is when I'm talking? Because I swear in parts of it, they cut out. I'm halfway through a sentence and they cut out what I'm saying and then splice in the end of another sentence. Now, this interview's fine. It doesn't actually make it sound like I was saying anything, I don't think, that I didn't actually mean to say, but it just seems really weird.
The main findings of the research were the highest invested group were more...
So it's the highest invested group in terms of fantasy football research, how much time someone spends invested in the game.
More likely to encounter problems with things like anxiety, depression as a result of the game compared to players who are less involved.
So that's really interesting. So, what could be quite relaxing for some people actually is enormously stressful for other people.
Yeah, exactly. The flip side of it, which wasn't mentioned when it was picked, the study was picked up by a lot of newspapers, is also the people who are more invested actually get a lot more positive emotions as well. So if their team does well, they'll get more enjoyment out of it. But when their team does badly and they're doing badly compared to their friends, or when they compare their team to other people on Twitter, it's going to make them feel a lot worse.
So,
as I say, unlike the Daily Star, at least they did present both sides of the research here. A bit more of a realistic. They let me put across a bit of more realistic portrayal of what their research actually shows.
For a Radio 4 audience, until quite recently, the analogy would be, like betting on the horses and studying the form for ages and making an informed decision. Your team is a fantasy, but the stats have to be very, very real.
Yeah.
I've got no idea what she was talking about there. I just agreed with it because I've got no idea about horse racing. I'm guessing the people who listen to Radio 4 are generally quite upper class and posh, which I'm not. I don't know.
Yes, yeah.
Does it make a difference if money is involved or not?
So the Premier League actually discourages people from getting involved in what we call money leagues, which is...
I think that's true. Tell me in the comments if I'm wrong.
It's basically a mini league is they're quite popular. Anyone who plays fantasy football know. Basically, with say 20 people at work, for example, everyone puts a tenner in each, and the winner takes, I don't know, it'd be £1,000, I guess, if there was 100 people in it. There is a lot of people who do that, but we found that people who are involved in many...
I have a feeling my maths was wrong now. I was a bit quite nervous doing this.
Leagues, for example, more money leagues they're invested in, again, the more likely they are to become stressed or anxious if they do that.
Okay, so, just taking, parking the money to one side, because, as you say, most people don't do that. But there are lots of leagues that are just for the heck of it.
Yeah.
What are the kind of anxieties and the kind of stresses that your research has turned out?
We measured how much anxiety and stress was generally related rather than what the specific anxieties and stresses were. But we also found that people who are more engaged, for example, have more of a problematic work-life balance in relation to fantasy football. So, for example, they report, compared to players who are less engaged, for example, having problems in their relationships or focusing at work because of fantasy football.
So, that's true. Again, someone who is really engaged in fantasy football, it's more likely to, example, interfere with their work. And I've just given an example earlier on in this video of how I almost turned down a really good opportunity from a career perspective, and also just from, I enjoyed going on BBC Radio. I almost turned down that opportunity because it was clashed with the FPL deadline. So there's a real life example of that for you there.
Is it mostly a male thing, a male preserved fantasy football, or more women?
I think from our sample in that particular study, it was about 6% were female.
6?
Out of 100. So certainly there are females that play it. I mean, whether or not that would be reflective, because that was, as I say, quite a
committed
bunch, yeah.
Well, I mean, it's almost 6 o'clock. And
yeah, what I basically meant there is I don't know how many females play fantasy football. It may well be more than 6%, but this was like really engaged people who were willing to take part in a 30-odd minute study on fantasy football. So, certainly of the engaged players that we measured, only 6% were female.
6:30, the window closes. So around the country, around the world, people playing fantasy football. Is this the most frenetic time? And what are a lot of people going through right now?
Game week 1 is a time where you can still change around all your players. Usually on a week-by-week basis, you can only make one transfer, or you usually only make one transfer. So it's quite frenetic trying to solidify your team.
And as somebody who's played it, seriously, and studied it as an academic, feeling a bit twitchy right now? Are you happy with the team you've got?
Yeah, fairly happy. Fairly happy.
You took an age to answer.
Fairly happy, but
right.
Straight away after this, I will be going and fiddling around with my team to see if there's any changes I can make.
Okay, and if there was one...
Yeah, I think they actually said they were going to put this out like half an hour before... It would have finished half an hour before the FPL deadline. So, yeah.
One player that you could recommend everyone should buy if they have the cash.
Alexander Isak.
Well, that's aged well, hasn't it? Alexander Isak, who of course everyone was saying was essential at the start of the season, but then ended up doing absolutely terribly. Okay, yeah, I just thought that would be like an interesting-ish little video to make. Hopefully the full video we're actually going to discuss FPL mental health in more detail will be out in a few days. Thank you, like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video, and I will see you in the next one.